So just a very quick word of welcome for everyone who came out tonight to listen to Ann Lauterbach's lecture. And we're very thankful, in fact, for Anne's presence here tonight and Olivier Brossard's work in putting this event together. Olivier, who's right behind the camera and who will be busy filming this tremendous talk, very exciting lecture, which is part of a series of lectures and conferences that take place here at the Sorbonne, organized by Vallée, our research group here, and Poetry Beyond, the team of researchers in the field of poetry. And so really heartfelt thanks to Olivier Brossard, who is an associate professor at Paris-Est et Marne-la-Vallée and a member of the EUF, and who curates the research project Poets and Critics. So this lecture is also happening because John Ashbery's critically acclaimed collection, Self-Portrait in a Convex Mirror, is on the national syllabus for the agrégation in English. So there is considerable interest in John Ashbery this year and next. So just a few words about Ann Lauterbach, who grew up in Manhattan, where she studied painting and then was an undergraduate student in English at the University of Wisconsin-Madison before becoming a graduate student at Columbia University. She lived in London for 7 years, working as an editor, teacher, and curator of literary events at the Institute of Contemporary Arts. Returning to New York in 1974, Ann Lauterbach worked in art galleries and began to publish poetry and art criticism. She taught in numerous writing programs, including Brooklyn College, Columbia, Iowa City College, and the Graduate Center of CUNY. She was also a visiting court critic for sculpture at the Yale School of Art for several years and a poet in residence in St. Petersburg, Russia. Anne has written on a variety of artists, as well as poets like John Ashbery. She's published 10 collections of poetry, most recently Spell, out of Penguins in 2018. Her prose has been collected in The Night Sky, Writings on the Poetics of Experience, published by Viking in 2006, The Given and the Chosen, and St. Petersburg Notebook. Ann Lauterbach has received many prestigious fellowships, including one from the Guggenheim and another from the MacArthur Foundation. Her 2009 collection, Or to Begin Again, was nominated for a National Book Award. And finally, Anne has been, since 1990, co-chair of writing in the interdisciplinary Milton Avery School of the Arts, and since 1997, Ruth and David Schwab, professor of languages and literature at Bard College. Her talk is entitled Time Watching Itself, Narrativity and the Ordinary Sublime in John Ashbery's Self-Portrait in a Convex Mirror. Please join me in welcoming Ann Lauterbach.
And my thanks right back to you. I hope my voice clears up. It's whenever I'm really nervous, this happens. I get this little frog in here. So we'll just tell it to go away. Maybe it will. I'm delighted to be here. Also extremely surprised to be here. I didn't really think that in my life I would be giving a talk at the Sorbonne. But here I am, and here you are, and I'm very grateful to you for coming. I regret that my French is very spotty, and so I'm hoping that the fact that this is in English isn't troublesome for you. It's a kind of meandering talk, the way Ashbery is meandering. I think my mind and his had something, some affinities. So my logics are not so very far from his logics, although the content, of course, quite different. So don't feel that I just want you to know that I'm not going to make an argument. I'm just going to wander around a little bit in these extremely wandering poems. And hopefully in the wander, you will discover one or two objets that are interesting and useful to you. Once again, many thanks for hosting me, and in particular to Olivier Brossard, who is a kind of magician when it comes to attending to and thinking about and caring for not the most obvious characters on the poetic scene. I am extremely grateful to him. Okay, time watching itself, narrativity, and the ordinary sublime in John Ashbery's self-portrait in a convex mirror. It's about 20 pages, it'll probably take about an hour, and I would be absolutely delighted to answer or try to answer any questions you might have at the end. It's in 6 parts with a coda. The parts really are just there for my own peculiar desire to have rooms inside of my meanderings. 1. I did not foresee when Olivier Brossard kindly invited me to speak about John Ashbery's most celebrated book that it would prove to be quite so recalcitrant, that speaking into the absence of my great friend would arouse so many disparate impulses, among them the desire to be cogent and useful to you, the desire to say something fresh about this writer whose work has attracted so much commentary by poets and critics, the desire to register at least some of the ways in which Ashbery the poet and John the friend were guides to me for more than 4 decades, beginning in 1971 when I was living in London and working at the Institute of Contemporary Arts. I had invited John Ashbery to be part of a series I curated on contemporary French, East European, and American poetry. It was a fortuitous moment, just enough beyond the furies of '68, but near enough to the counterculture to allow stuffy England to embrace this most cosmopolitan, elusive, and beguiling poet's work. It was an encounter that proved to be enduring for me, about which I could say many things, but for now I will say simply that I loved him, the person who is now in the past, and his work, which is in the present and the future. So perhaps it is not surprising that I chose to speak to you about one of its signal traits, its relation to time, and how that affected the making and unmaking of narrative. So much can be said on this topic. I can only suggest the ways in which an awareness of time informs this book, perhaps most clearly in the title poem. It is one of many paradoxes or contradictions that a poem dedicated to a painting, to a visual experience, should elicit a profound meditation on time. Is this popping too much? Is it okay? Sound okay? Across much of John Ashbery's work, temporal conditions, tenses, and weathers and their variables are often foregrounded, even as they act as a kind of backdrop, one that calls forth our and his continuous attention. But beyond these intrinsic reasons, I want to acknowledge that Ashbery was writing at the terminus of the modernist project and at the beginning of whatever it is that has followed. The radical energies of modernist form-making had subsided, but the muddy waters of the postmodern condition had not quite taken hold. The peculiarly American urge for a transcendent sublime had given way to what Wallace Stevens called an age of disbelief. Whatever wonder and amazement and awe might be discovered will arise from a state of disenchantment. So we might say that Ashbery's acute awareness of time was both personal and historical, as he came into his mature years on the cusp of post-war optimism, both at home and here in Paris. Along with others in his immediate cohort, he turns the sound or diction of poetry away from grandeur and solemnity towards the demotic and ordinary. But he was unwilling to sacrifice the ambition for a poetry that asks enduring questions about the nature of life, the limits of reality, and the usefulness of knowledge. I recall when first hearing him read a sense of rare excitement. It was as if he were offering liberation from the constraints of the perfectly made poem, the tidy artifact of personal insight and perception. I remember thinking, a poem can be capacious, not because of length, but because you can put pretty much anything into it. It can move within itself. It can be a strange, uncertain adventure like life. Very broadly speaking, Ashbery's work variously addresses what I take to be the core quandaries of the modern period. What is the contemporary and how does it encounter history? What is the relation between the one and the many? How does art engage both the particular and abstract? What is the self in relation to an other? To this list, I would add what separates the empirical real from the moral true. But the truth had passed on to divide all, Ashbery would write later, in the new spirit. The second part of my title, The Ordinary Sublime, is a bit risky, as both the term ordinary and the term sublime are difficult for me to fully grasp. A friend, Richard Deming at Yale, has written a book called The Art of the Ordinary. He asked me to contribute an essay to a collection about the ordinary, and I could not. I didn't know how to separate ideas of the normal from ideas of the ordinary. As for the sublime, it is here to indicate a certain tradition in American poetics and philosophy, from Dickinson and Emerson through William James and Whitman, Santayana and Stevens, Richard Rorty and Susan Howe, which has had an uneasy but palpable relation to the transcendental sublime that animated the Romantic period, what my colleague at Bard, Matthew Mutter, has called restless secularism. So this pattern, this thing, is really, I'm not really going to be talking about this, but there is a current, I think, through this kind of major line in American poetics that is just uneasy in relation to all forms of faith, of any spirit, but it's there, it's always there, it's always threatening or wanting to become something. And Ashbery, I think if you read Ashbery in a certain light, you see this fairly constantly, and its resistance or subversion. This is what Harold Bloom writes about so convincingly in his 1976 book, Figures of Capable Imagination, where he draws a line from Pater and Coleridge through to Stevens and Ashbery, whose work, he says, has a skeptical honesty, self-reflexive, and an odd faith in a nearly inscrutable order, which Bloom elaborates is to be found in Ashbery's largest aesthetic principle, the notion that every day the world consented to be shaped into a poem. These two observations seem right and are helpful in thinking about self-portrait in a convex mirror, about Ashbery's relation in general to time and to the ordinary as capable of giving up or out a specific kind of sublimity, call it a poem, one that constantly flirts with moments of amazement and awe, but swerves away on the willing wings of a supple, if sometimes exasperating, syntax. The Ashberyan poem hovers like a bird over its subject, sometimes diving into focus and sometimes staying just above, observing, circling, reflecting. And so early in the book, Absolute Clearance, he writes, you have some handouts, I think, so this is the first quote. And out over the ocean, the wish persisted to be a dream at home, cloud or bird asleep in the trough of discursive waters. Teasing the blowing light with its ultimate assurance, severity of its curved smile, like the eagle that hangs and drops. The familiar Ashberyan tone is convivial, relaxed, mildly detached, free of emotional urgency, neither as chatty and personal as his friend Frank O'Hara, nor as elegant and stately as Wallace Stevens. Wallace Stevens isn't always stately. I just want to make sure you know I understand that he's not always stately, but he is always elegant. The poems unfold at their own pace, in their own time. The casual diction is one of someone speaking, even when it moves towards abstract thoughts. But to whom? I've sometimes thought that the experience of reading a poem by John Ashbery is akin to riding in an airplane. The engine goes smoothly on, its drone uninterrupted and invariable, while the air outside is by turns turbulent or calm, the view a vast blue or obscured by pressing clouds, the light brilliant, mottled or ink dark, punctuated by floating stars. Inside the cabin things happen. The cabin is crammed with persons and their belongings and with various devices that make us think we are still in touch with the other outer world. It is not always clear we have bought the right ticket. We thought we were heading for Miami, but the plane has veered off to Iceland. We thought we were inside a tidy compartment, a poem, but it is suddenly wet and cold, and there are strangers flying beside us like a flock of seagulls. Time is in relation to other time. As he writes, the times when a slow horse along a canal bank seems irrelevant, and the truth, the best is its best example of time in relation to other time. I hate to fly, as did John. When I asked him in 1971 to come to London to read, he said no, because he didn't want to fly. Well, he said, perhaps I could come if I could stay at the Ritz. We managed to find the necessary funding, and indeed he stayed with the very young David Kermani at the Ritz. It is in their room that he read to a small group of us one evening after dinner from a manuscript of new work. How are we doing? That's part one. Part two. As is well known, Ashbery also had an aversion to explaining his poems. He thought they were their own best explanation, and he was no doubt correct. So in the opening pages of the 1989-90 Charles Eliot Norton lectures at Harvard, he remarked, quote, "I am not very good at explaining my work. I am unable to do so because I feel that my poetry is the explanation of what? Of my thought, whatever that is. As I see it, my thought is both poetry and the attempt to explain that poetry. The two cannot be disentangled. On occasions when I have tried to discuss the meanings of my poems, I have found that I was inventing plausible-sounding ones which I knew to be untrue." He dwells a bit more on this conundrum and then resumes, "For me, poetry has its beginning and ending outside thought. Thought is certainly involved in the process. Indeed, there are times when my work seems to me to be merely a recording of my thought processes without regard to what they are thinking about. If this is true, then I would like to acknowledge my intention of somehow turning these processes into poetic objects, a position perhaps akin to Dr. Williams' no ideas but in things, but with the caveat that, for me, ideas are also things." What, we might ask, does he mean when he says that poetry has its beginnings and endings outside of thought? This outside, this otherness, this beyond, is at the core of his poetics. For John Ashbery, poems and thoughts or ideas are things. I would add that for him, language was also a kind of thing, if we mean that it has certain material qualities that we commonly associate with things: weight, color, density, shape. Writing moves in tandem with our consciousness of language. Words cross and recross the horizon of the page or the screen as it moves vertically down. They create a kind of fabric, weaving thought patterns across temporal paths. The word and its referent are in a shadow play rather than a transparent window. This isn't metaphysical, but it does touch on some of the philosophical ideas around language that were circulating in the 1970s. Ashbery lived in Paris from, you probably know this, 1955 to 57 on Fulbright, and then again from 58 to 65, and I wondered how deeply he was engaged with the philosophical and poetic conversations in those times. As you know, his translations from French authors, both in prose and poetry, are voluminous, and they range from Alfred Jarry, Raymond Roussel, Henri Michaud, and Marcelin Planet in prose to Mallarmé, Rimbaud, René Char, Pierre Montori, his great friend and lover, and Franck-André Jeanne, among the many poets. I wish my French were not rudimentary, so I could speak a little about this profound engagement with your writers, but I am conscious of how little he seemed to be drawn to the philosophical thinkers who were so present when he was writing self-portrait. I never heard him mention Derrida or Barthes or Deleuze. I don't think he cared for theory, but at the same time, theory was everywhere when he lived here, and when he returned to New York, the hyper-theoretical journal October was founded in 1976. He found his poetic footing in experience itself, including, of course, the experience of reading, looking at art, listening to music, and he wished his work to be a record of his continuous engagement with the materials and processes of living, where living is a plurality and inclusivity, a wide horizon of thought, perception, and incident, unfettered by notions of linear cause and effect. What Gertrude Stein, whose work he greatly admired, he called it a hymn to possibility, had dismissed as puerile ideas of beginnings, middles, and ends. So she had also kind of contempt for what she took that beginnings, middles, and ends. She thought that was very marked as an American idea. How does one convert empty time into the life of time? Well, one way is to write. This is one way to observe time watching itself. As he writes in Scheherazade, the light in the old house, the secret way the rooms fed into each other, but all was wariness of time watching itself, for nothing in the complex story grew outside. The greatness of the moment of telling strayed unresolved until its wealth of incident, pain mixed with pleasure, faded in the precise moment of bursting into bloom, its growth a static lament. The poems in self-portrait mention time so frequently that it may seem redundant to even bring it up. Time is both subject and object. The poems are about time, while simultaneously enacting its performance within poetic structures. Here, for example, in the Odd poem, whose lines are set without capitals on the first words, I think it's the only one in the book where he didn't capitalize the first letter of the words. As you came from the Holy Land, so that's the name of the poem, the next line of which it's important to know, but I won't tell you because I don't quote it, but maybe we'll come back to that. As you came from the Holy Land, right? So this is partway through the poem. It is finally as though that thing of monstrous interest were happening in the sky, but the sun is setting and prevents you from seeing it. Out of night, the token emerges. It leaves like birds alighting all at once under a tree, taken up and shaken again, put down in weak rage, knowing as the brain does that it can never come about, not here, not yesterday in the past, only in the gap of today, filling itself as emptiness is distributed in the idea of what time it is when that time is already past. It is probably not an accident that Deleuze and Guattari in Anti-Oedipus were thinking about a basis for a production that was at once social and desiring in a logic of flows. At more or less the same time as John Ashbery was reinventing the poem for our time, a poetics of what Deleuze would later call pure immanence. As Gertrude Stein remarked, nothing changes from generation to generation except the thing seen, and that makes a composition. What was the thing seen for Ashbery, and how did it compose itself? I would say that he saw that the world is not divided into oppositions and dualities, but is fluid, a flowchart, made up of countless images and events that generate forms of disparate inclusivity. He made the syntactical membrane between subject and object moot, or at least blurred, so that what might be considered internal or subjective fuses with the external or objective. In fact, he seems to have wholly rejected the harsh dualities that are so obdurate in post-Enlightenment thought: good, evil, true, false, man, woman, and so forth. Not surprisingly, we find ourselves often in the liminal world of dream, but dreams free from their psychological Freudian baggage. Sentences in English begin with the subject which in the predicate finds its object. This is what we are taught at school, or at least this is what we are taught in school, or what we were once taught in school. But in an Ashbery poem, this separation is often confounded. The self, that is the I, is not going to lead directly to its am or is. So that how it thinks or knows itself will be as an encounter with the things of and in the world, to such a degree that the whole question of the self becomes seen or understood as contingent, perspectival, aspectual. It's a very big sentence, but you get the point. The point is that somehow Ashbery, because of this, because he's ill at ease with the I as identified with himself, one begins to see that the formation of the subject, the I or the he or the you, if that's at the beginning of a sentence, really what he's interested in is the encounter. It's all about what happens to that. The actual existence of the I is a kind of vagary, I want to say. Ashbery undertakes to explore the self as a sequence of responses to the world. The poems are fields of attention that unwind or unfurl along paths of astounding variety, paths that lead nowhere in particular, except into the next path. The poems in self-portrait could be construed as a series of questions about the relation of the self to the other that constitutes a self. This is announced in the very first page of Self-Portrait. The book. A look of glass stops you and you walk on shaken. Was I the perceived? Did they notice me this time as I am, or is it postponed again? Someday I'll claim to you how all used up I am because of you, but in the meantime the ride continues. Everyone is long for the ride, it seems. Besides, what else is there? The annual games? Questions occur in nearly all the poems. They act as friction to keep things going, to interrupt or assuage or evade intensities. In Grand Gallop, we find a protracted meditation on time as passive, a waiting game. He writes, only waiting, the waiting, what fills up the time between? It is another kind of wait, waiting for the wait to be ended. Nothing takes up its fair share of time. The wait is built into the things just coming into their own. Nothing is partially incomplete, but the wait invests everything like a climate. What time of day is it? Does anything matter? Yes, for you must wait to see what it is really like, this event rounding the corner, which will be unlike anything else and really cause no surprise. It's too ample. This ample thing of monstrous interest that will be unlike anything else, what is it? 3. That Ashbery wrote about visual art for many years has affected our sense of his poetics. His attention to the visual was acute, informed, and informing. But he knew also a great deal about music, in particular the dissonant music of radical modernity, Berg, Webern, Schoenberg, as well as more lyrical composers, Satie, Berio, Delius. I have long believed that it is this aspect of his knowledge that gave his poems their peculiar pacing, tone, and narrative complexity. His biographer, Karen Rothman, tells me that he was listening a lot to the Schoenberg string quartets during the time he was writing the poems in self-portrait. You could just, if you were teaching this, you could just play those quartets and leave, and then everybody would just deal with it. Anyway, the inspiration for Litany, which is a long poem for two voices, which he and I read together on a number of occasions, was inspired by the American composer Elliott Carter's duo for violin and piano. Just as there are few intact stories in his poems, there are few pictorial scenes. Rather, there are glances, fragments, some more lasting than others, but mostly we feel we're always moving toward or away from something, just as in a piece of music. As we move along, the past or previous notes are joined by other notes. At times, as in chamber or orchestral music, we hear many notes simultaneously. In the title poem of Self-Portrait, this musical sense is everywhere evident, especially in the way a particular word and its variants will be sounded through a whole sequence of lines: dream, possible, promises, today. The musical analogy may be one way of thinking about Ashbery's frequent use of such modifying adverbs as meanwhile. He uses this constantly desire to have one thing going on and then something else as well. Things are happening while other things are also happening. Time is dynamic, spatial, layered. Ashbery's poems are invariably a record of this phenomenon. Only in his case, what is happening is the poem, and the poem is a recording of its own happening. Again, time watching itself. In the opening poem of the collection, As One Put Drunk into the Packet Boat, I won't enter, I put him drunk into a taxi many times. I just want to register that for posterity. In the opening poem of the collection, As One Put Drunk into the Packet Boat, the relation between, or rather the simultaneous existence of the one and the many, singular and plural, is an aspect of his poetics of inclusion, in which there is a constant effort to balance the single episode or the single person against the ongoing expansive panoply, what is called a few lines later, the promise of that fullness. Quote, this is number 3 and I think 9, can't tell, can't read it. New sentences were starting up, but the summer was well along, not yet past the midpoint, but full and dark with the promise of that fullness. That time when one can no longer wander away, and even the least attentive fall silent to watch the thing that is prepared to happen. We will not, of course, be told what that thing is. This is the magical, if sometimes infuriating, trait of Ashbery's chronic swerve away from declarations or statements. Let's call them conclusions or consequences, understood as the result of a prior experience. Over and over, we are invited to anticipate or await an unnamed, never-arriving, momentous something. This perpetual habit was undoubtedly informed by his earlier reading and translating of Mallarmé's Igitur, figured into his own 1965 work, Fragment, where he explicitly engages or tests the continuity of experience against the supreme fiction, the visionary idea. The fragment haunts late modernity as a trope of disintegration and ruin. For Ashbery, it begins to transform into a kind of humility, an acceptance of the partial as sufficient, if one pays sufficient attention to it. In our poem, Summer is Well Along, Ashbery's birthday was the 28th of July, and so we might conclude that the one to whom he is referring is himself. The earliest poems in Self-Portrait were published in 1972, when Ashbery, born in 27, was 45. As it happens, this was exactly the middle of his life's journey. We are in a kind of dark wood, full and dark with the promise of that darkness, and we are uncertain about the path, the straight road ahead. But as we know, Ashbery was not interested in writing about himself. Indeed, I once heard him say, Ashbery writes the poems, I am John. I think he made this comment in accepting one of his many awards, and it was on this occasion that I first heard him quote, the now famous remark by Rimbaud, j'ai un autre. The other, that is, I, Ashbery took to heart, as it allowed him to move with his now famous promiscuity across the pronominal landscape. The poem continues, the children still at their games, clouds that arise with a swift impatience in the afternoon sky, then dissipate as limpid, dense twilight comes. Shifts in the atmosphere, weather, and light provide Ashbery with a continuous awareness of both setting and a change in that setting. Are the children still at their games in the same place as we were at the beginning of the poem? It is the same sun, but it is at the same place. We were in the beginning waiting for someone to come. Here, the waiting has moved to the action of the clouds that arise with a swift impatience. The temporal and spatial exigencies of the poem are layered in undecidable relation, a typical Ashberian combining of local incident with the vagaries of ordinary set conventions. Children, sky, twilight, clouds meet up with impatience, postponement, and perception. It's a funny jagged space, that space between these common materials and then these words that swing out from the fiction. Because once you're usually in a fiction, an author doesn't pull out and observe the thing that they're writing. It's not always true. I take it back. The third stanza gathers itself into a new tonal register brought to us by the tooting of a horn, which could be either a car or a musical instrument or both. This tooting begins on a crescendo. Only in that tooting of a horn down there, for a moment, I thought the great formal affair was beginning, orchestrated, its colors concentrated in a glance, a ballade that takes in the whole world now, but lightly, still lightly, but with wide authority and tact. As so often, the poem tells us about itself, about its desire to enact the great formal affair, which is both concentrated and glancing, orchestrated, capable of taking in the whole world with a light touch, but also with, indeed, wide authority and tact. Here again, there is a suggestion of a great, important event that never fully arrives. Ashbery likes to rise to a sonorous or melodic consonance and then to begin again in a new, unexpectedly dissonant key, a new mood. The grandeur of the phrase wide authority and tact is followed by a question which in turn turns us back or forward to the setting sun and to yet another scenic moment, one where you have fallen asleep and I reappears and a her come to ask once more if I was coming in and not to hurry in case I wasn't. This return to a glimpse of the vernacular, this outtake from a scene grounds the poem, keeps it from losing touch with the ordinary, even as it flirts with the extraordinary. The final stanza of this first poem in Self-Portrait ends with yet another tone, one in which I want to say Ashbery gathers many of his most enduring and endearing characteristics, the pleasure of the catalog or list, a diction that employs both simple and arcane words, an ability to say something profound without sounding profound, lightly, all combined to register something like an ordinary sublime. The night is taken over. A moon of Cistercian pallor has climbed in the corner of heaven, installed, finally involved with the business of darkness. And a sigh heaves from all the small things on earth, the books, the papers, the old garters and union suit buttons kept in a white cardboard box somewhere, and all the lower versions of cities flattened under the equalizing night. The summer demands and takes away too much. But night, the reserved, the reticent, gives more than it takes. Here we get a sense of Ashbery's habitual receptivity. I often had a sense that his mind was constantly scanning for new materials. He loved reading the local papers, for the oddness of the normative. He was curious and he liked facts, especially little-known, overlooked, or arcane facts. He was drawn to the minor, the other tradition. Many years ago, I was told by someone who actually seemed to have known this, that Marcel Duchamp had said that he never did anything unless it amused him. I feel this was also true of John. He liked to be amused, and he liked to amuse. Whenever I tell people that particular little anecdote about Duchamp, I always say, for the French, amusement is completely different from what it is for Americans. I have to explain over and over again. I just feel like, no. Duchamp, when he said he didn't like to do something unless it amused him, it meant something very particular that belongs to your word and not to our word. So I mean it in your sense for Ashbery. He wasn't really interested in being entertained. 4. We're getting there. I told Olivier that I would not speak about the title poem, but then I found myself lost inside of it. As if I had inadvertently wandered into a room in a museum I had no intention of visiting and found it was closing time when I finally left. So I shall spend the remaining time with you thinking about this most engrossing and kinetic, ekphrastic meditation. Accepting the Robert Frost Medal in 1955, Ashbery remarked, "It seemed perfectly natural that the subject of my remarks would be myself or my poetry, since we are what is getting honored here, though normally I go to extreme lengths not to talk about either of us because I don't really know that much about us." A self-portrait, even one in a convex mirror, is a kind of reckoning, an assessment. Ashbery's choice of the Parmigianino painting as his poem's subject, as well as the title of the whole collection, Voici, creates a doubling effect. So we are invited to contemplate simultaneously Ashbery's description of the painting as Parmigianino did it, and his own way of doing it being his own self-portrait, even as we were hoping to keep it hidden. Here, the temporal relations we have been noting are rendered literal if extremely complex or convex. The first observation in the poem is that the painting distorts, making the right hand bigger than the head, thrusting out towards the viewer and then swerving easily away as though to protect what it advertises. These words resonate. Swerving advertises. The first reminds us of Lucretius and the swerve of atoms that suggested to the philosopher the possibility of free will, and the many ways the idea of the Kleeman has informed some thinking about writing since. It also announces what we already know, that the poem itself will also protectively swerve. The second word, advertises, has of course a distinctly American flavor, even as it is an old word meaning to draw attention to something. It is a typical Ashbery gesture to choose words that are both ordinary and unexpectedly fresh in their usage. I expect that's true of almost all poets who are worth anything, to use ordinary words unexpectedly. The time of day or the density of the light adhering to the face keeps it lively and intact. On a recurring wave of arrival, the soul establishes itself. We sense that at some level, Ashbery is here once again describing his own way of establishing his own poetics as a recurring wave of arrival. If we can say that the lines of his poems behave like waves, earlier I said a textile, that are in a continuum, a sequence of arrivals, or a continuous presentness. Later in the poem, we return to the wave, comparing the forms of ideal beauty to a wave breaking on a rock, giving up its shape in a gesture that expresses that shape. This recursive doubling refutes an account of past, present, and future as a sequence of events and their consequences, since one is always cresting into one's present. The narrator dwells on the idea of the soul, which is kept in captive suspension, awaiting your look as it intercepts the picture. So that's a very clear moment where you see that Ashbery is so interested in this idea of attention, that attention actually is what makes anything important. It's only because of that that something is picked out of this great, massive, plural space. The narrator dwells on the idea of the soul, which is kept in captive suspension, awaiting your look as it intercepts the picture. The soul, somehow perceptible, longs to be free. We do not receive a description of the face itself, but only of its expression, its gaze of tenderness, amusement, and regret, so powerful in its restraint that one cannot look for long. The secret is too plain. The pity of it smarts, makes hot tears spurt. That the soul is not a soul, has no secret, is small, and fits its hollow perfectly, its room, our moment of attention. The swiftness of the shifts in these lines is unnerving as we move from the affective register of tenderness, amusement, and regret to the sudden anguished contraction. This is one of the very few moments in my reading of Ashbery where the calamity of recognition occasions bleak sorrow, hot tears spurt. The entire spiritual realm collapses into the small hollow of a room, a fleet, agonized, reduced containment. It has the feeling of a confession or the dropping of a mask rescued only by our moment of attention. This is the very definition of the ordinary sublime as a negative space, There is a sense, a contraction. There is a sense of attenuation, as if suddenly there is only one instrument playing its meager tune, perhaps an etude by Eric Satie. The poem continues, that is the tune, but there are no words. The words are only speculation, from the Latin speculum, mirror. They seek and cannot find the meaning of the music. As the doubt about the possibility of finding meaning arises, so too the image of the globe is introduced, but it is life englobed. Very funny word, englobed. We could trace from here the many references to circularity and roundness that ensue: sphere, ping-pong boy, balloon, curved hand, round mirror, carousel, circle, bubble chamber, eggs, much later in the poem, a crystal ball. Circularity is posited against linearity. Throughout Ashbery's work, the circadian rhythms of day and night are constant temporal markers. In Self-Portrait, the fact of Parmigianino's mirror portrait, his rendering the velocities of the rounded, reflecting surface, gives Ashbery a way to think about the relation of a given self to the inhabited world, and to ask how much that self and that world can ever be conveyed, captured, realized in any medium, words, pictures, music. Here, as elsewhere, these questions revolve around singularity, a self fragment or sample, and wholes or sums. The globe or circle extracted and elaborated from the portrait's rounded mirror is the trope for entirety, inclusivity, and the poem turns through partial arcs that imply the necessary givenness of incomplete knowledge. So that's sort of interesting for me to think about, that he posits this idea of the circle or the whole or the globe, and against that are these kind of arcing, partial, they're not really fragments, they're parts of the whole. It's a different kind of thinking, I think, which I'm trying to convey. It's hard to kind of get to it because it's not the fragment and the whole. It's not broken off. It's a part of something. Everything is a part of something else. There's this kind of continuum implied. The globe or circle extracted and elaborated from the portrait's rounded mirror is the trope for entirety, inclusivity, and the poem turns through partial arcs that imply the necessary givenness of an incomplete knowledge. So toward the end of the poem, each person has one big theory to explain the universe, but it doesn't tell the whole story. And in the end, it is what is outside him that matters to him, and especially to us who have been given no help whatever in decoding our own man-sized quotient and must rely on secondhand knowledge. And earlier, and the vase is always full because there is only just so much room, and it accommodates everything. The sample one sees is not to be taken as merely that, but as everything as it may be imagined outside time, not as a gesture, but as all in the refined, assimilatable state. What does it mean to imagine outside time, and how does the vase represent the all or everything of the refined, assimilatable state? Assimilable. I think I put too many syllables in there. My sense is that here Ashbery is resisting the temptation to reach for the transcendent register and settles instead for the vase, the local container of the refined and knowable, so that whatever is imagined outside of time is contained within it. This material image, no ideas but in things, suggests that objects indeed are the locale of what I am calling the ordinary sublime, where everything is contained in a refined state. Something between the distillations of a still life, nature mort, or self-portrait, and the presence of living beings, a bouquet. I'm not sure that's very cogent. The brilliant collusion or collision of the visual and oral, the cerebral and the material, the mirror and the music, speculation and its uncertainties is central to this poem and to my sense that all of Ashbery's work is an inquiry into the ways acts of perception fuse with acts of saying or knowing in the search of a reality that cannot ever be contained, a very exacting kind of epistemological undertaking in which ideas of the real and ideas of the true are in tantalizing tandem relation, empirical reality and beliefs about reality in an intimate dance. I'm reminded here of William James' remark that truth is what happens to an idea, which is about as succinct a definition of Ashbery's poetics as I can imagine. The visual world of scenes and pictures of objects in space, of lights and colors, all are under the illuminating spell of the mind listening to itself at its moment of attention. This brings to mind another of William James' descriptions that thought happens not as a stream of consciousness, but rather like a bird with its flights and perchings. As darkness encroaches, a perverse light whose imperative of subtlety dooms in advance its conceit to light up, we encounter a pinpoint of a smile, a spark, a star, and finally a dozing whale on the sea bottom in relation to the tiny, self-important ship on the surface. Ashbery gathers us towards sites of illumination and then draws attention to the unillumined darkness, which seems always to be a place of an unknown and profound possibility, and to new thoughts about scale, the relation of one thing to another in space, and to the surface. So the idea of scale and surface, of course, germane to all talk about visual art more than maybe others. But also this idea about the night seems very interesting to me, that over and over again it seems to me the night is the place where, because of the place of dream, I think, where there is a copiousness or a possibility that doesn't exist in this landscape of the day. We might note here that Ashbery elides not only the subject-object divide, but he avoids most of the harsh dualities of our divided and divisive world. He likes the in-between, the almost, the not quite, the twilight. He saw, I think, that in the ambiguities of the undecided there is most freedom. In the plural is the chance for demotic inclusion. So it's just touching on what I take to be his politics and the small sense of politics. So in this poem's next sequence of waves of arrival, we enter a prolonged contemplation of the fact of the sphere or globe or convex mirror and the variable scale or spatial relations they suggest. It arrives as a kind of aria or soliloquy in which constellation of related terms, starting with the globe and ending with a return to an instantiation of the original gesture in the painting. Your gesture, which is neither embrace nor warning, but which holds something of both in pure affirmation that doesn't affirm anything. In his way to this inconclusive paradox, this inconclusive paradox, Ashbery contemplates both the spherical globe like ours and the depiction of the room in which there is a sliver of window or mirror that reflects the weather, which he remarks in French is le temps, the word for time, and which follows a course wherein changes are merely features of the whole. Are you doing okay? Are you kind of getting exhausted? I could get up and wander around, come back. I'm getting there. I had to write this. In Ashbery, as for Stevens, there is a continual juggling of the materials of the sensorium, what we encounter in the world of objects, as they meet the objects of mental interiority on the surface of the poem. The surface is what's there, and nothing can exist except what's there. Forgive me for quoting so much. You all have read this poem and do not need me to keep reciting from it. But one of the problems of writing about Ashbery, as we have commented, is that his work describes itself better than anything I might say. Everything I say is by way of postscript. Now the tone shifts as the balloons pops and the attention turns dully away. There ensues a confusion of person, an I, a he, a you appear, along with many people speaking through the foggy chiaroscuro of memory who become part of you until no part remains that is surely you. I is another. I think I should skip to the end. All right, you're all right. People are leaving. Nobody's asleep yet. Things become turbulent with thoughts being torn as the round mirror becomes a carousel speeding into chaos. Around the pole star of your eyes, which are empty, know nothing, dream but reveal nothing, the world of objects, the magma of interiors, is suddenly reduced to a neutral band, a silver blur, a blind leveling. This passage of the poem presents us with a thicket of confusion as we contemplate how the portrait rules out the extraneous forever, attesting only to the enchantment of self with self. So as we know by now, that's something that Ashbery would be very upset about or confused by or have difficulty with. We are in the crux of a narcissistic moment, a kind of trap proposed perhaps by art's will to seek perfection through available materials, I-beams, Muslim, coral, but only by eliminating the extraneous, which for Ashbery is often the source of greatest interest. Our narrator concludes, it doesn't matter because these are things as they are today before one's shadow ever grew out of the field into thoughts of tomorrow. Once again, the temporal cord twists into a knot. 5. The next section takes up ideas of the possible, of promise, and of dreams. Variants of these words recur, threaded across a landscape sweeping out from us to disappear on the horizon. Of course, some things are possible. We will try to do as many things as are possible. Even stronger possibilities can remain. What is promised today to keep the supposition of promises together? One cannot read through these passages without being reminded of Stephen's notes toward a supreme fiction. Actually, I think sometimes that if you read that poem, another kind of monster poem against this poem, there's a very interesting way in which they speak to each other. Or maybe I just made that up. One cannot read through these passages without being reminded of Stephen's notes toward a supreme fiction with its litany of anxious possibles as he entreats the poem to discover the order of the real. Stevens was, of course, beset by the very dualities that Ashbery refuses to embrace. Whatever ultimate questions the two poets share, their ways of approaching them are as different in tone as Bach is from Berg. Stevens wants the real to emerge as the order of major weather from the discoveries of the imagination, which for Ashbery is sourced in the play between dreams and the artifactual. Stevens' meditation calls up an angel of the absolute. Ashbery never permits such a figuration to arrive, but the Parmigianino portrait does allow an angel to make a mediated appearance. Indeed, what I am calling the ordinary sublime comes as the unfamiliar stereotype of the face in the portrait, which the narrator tells us Vasari had called rather angel than man. The narrator then muses, perhaps an angel looks like everything we have forgotten. I mean, forgotten things that don't seem familiar when we meet them again, lost beyond telling, which were ours once. This moment strikes me as having the strange quality I'm trying to evoke, the utterly unexpected alliance of how an angel looks with forgetting and re-encountering things which were ours once. The sublime is sublimated into acts of forgetting the familiar and then meeting them again, making the familiar strange, this time lost beyond telling. For Ashbery, the act of telling is what constitutes life. He is not able to speak about that which is lost outside of time or thought, but nevertheless, he is willing here as elsewhere to acknowledge it. You could pass over this moment without noticing it, as the narrator does, as he continues on to a deft exploration of later portraits before returning to the titular picture, which begins to converge with the narrative present, hinging on the repeated words surprise and reflection. What is novel is the extreme care in rendering the veilities of the rounded reflecting surface. It is the first mirror portrait, so that you could be fooled for a moment before you realize that the reflection isn't yours. These convergencies, the painting with the you, the self, the angel with forgotten things, notions of surprise and reflection, all insinuate a possible transcendent moment when an actual high-end erratic sublimity might occur, but the passage devolves into the ordinary, if exquisite vision of snowfall. It's a wonderful moment in this poem when he just looks up and looks out the actual window. The picture is almost finished, the surprise almost over, as when one looks out, startled by a snowfall, that which even now is ending in specks and sparkles of snow. Ashbery's need to keep his poems within the navigations of the ordinary while providing hints of the extraordinary is what has kept so many of his readers on high alert. The habit of his poems, like the Parmigianino portrait, is to constantly swerve away from the momentum of a conviction that had been building. But we know it cannot be sandwiched between two adjacent moments, that its windings lead nowhere except to further tributaries, and that these empty themselves into a vague sense of something that can never be known, even though it seems likely that each of us knows what it is and is capable of communicating it to each other. The initial subject of the it in this passage is love, but the meandering syntax is such that it is difficult to recall. It gets lost in that unknown, nameless thing, one that cannot be communicated, or perhaps not in words. A displaced eros, hiding far from the bodies in which this unknown known resides. 6, we're almost done. As we've seen across the poems in self-portrait, specificity is sacrificed and an indefinite hovering articulation arouses and thwarts our need for stability. We are kept in an animated continuum of linguistic play that almost never adds up. It's a poetics of heightened contingencies, temporal signals, ciphers for eventfulness. References to time and to its numerous tropes, days, nights, weathers, light, tomorrows, yesterdays, meanwhiles, the past, moments, the hours, waiting, pauses, forgettings, and tellings are so abundant they seem to be a kind of invisible substrate or matrix onto which Ashbery can hang his various objects. Proust may be the only other writer for whom time was such an insistent subject, but Ashbery is not concerned with retrieval or even with memory as such. As we have noted, the work is constant in its desire to inscribe its own present, the making of its present into the emptiness distributed across time. Time is a construction that allows him to move in and out, forward and back, around, behind, all in the service of this painful freshness of each thing being exactly itself. The method is one of continuance through deflection. Anticipatory moments devolve away from their fruition. The effective result hovers between the pleasurable mystery of a secret and the frustration of the forever postponed. The self-portrait of the artist as a poet thinking about a painter's self-portrait. The poem crests and recrests, crests and retreats on its smooth, perhaps even bland, but so enigmatic finish. Painting and poem converge into each other and separate like uncomfortable, estranged lovers. Is there anything to be serious about beyond this otherness that gets included in the most ordinary forms of daily activity, changing everything slightly and profoundly and tearing the matter of creation, any creation, not just artistic creation, from out of our hands to install it on some monstrous near peak, too close to ignore, too far for one to intervene? A certain painting came to mind. I didn't put it in, I was told to take it out. You'll know the painting. This otherness, this not being us, this is Ashbery still, this otherness, this not being us is all there is to look at in the mirror, though no one can say how it came to be this way. And then finally, or at last, we are all released from the mesmeric shield of a greeting that the portrait has caused the poet and his readers to endure. The hand holds no chalk, and each part of the whole falls off and cannot know it knew, except here and there in cold pockets of remembrance, whispers out of time. Here's my coda, as I am out of time. At some point, I began to think of John Ashbery as a great bird. I thought that all his poems occurred in air, on the breath, in the spirit, but also, as I suggested at the beginning, almost literally slightly above the landscapes over which they hover and glide. He looked a bit like a bird, with his startling eyes and his pronounced, elegant nose. It was a vision that never dissipated, even as it was a form of magical thinking. On the morning of his death, on the 3rd of September 2017, David Kermani phoned to let me know. I went outside and wandered a bit on my back lawn. Then suddenly, a large bird flew directly overhead and toward the Hudson River. Ah, I thought, there you are, and there you go. I wrote a short poem which became the epigraph for my latest book, Spell. And then you sail past in your effortless bravado, the sky a blue wind of ease, wings outstretched on a continuous whim, as if there were no time, and there isn't, but the rest of us pause, watching as you go on by. Thanks.
time for questions. If there are questions.
Or comments.
Many questions. Richard?
Thank you very much for this wonderful talk. And many different sort of glitterings and wonderful things. And we don't need a thesis. Right? That was better. But my questions, I don't really know how to formulate it very well either, but I have two that I'd like to ask. One is coming back to that allusion that you made to the self-portrait, the poem, self-portrait of the Congress here. The it in the long sentence, which ends up, we discovered that we know that the it refers to love, and you had this marvelous way of describing that we spoke of, this displaced arrows,
Right.
and what this unknown known resides in, something like that.
Yeah.
And that really, for me, seems to me important in the poem, which I read kind of, and I hear it quite important. So an encounter between the painter and the poet, and that somehow love has to do with this encounter, that it's an effective encounter in the work. And that, I don't know what more to say about that, but I'd like you to
The way I construe that strange mentioning of love, and then it just simply, you really have to track very far back to find that subject, that it. It occurred to me that how to say this? But there's a way in which Ashbery's work is disembodied, is not corporeal, does not think about the body in space. It's sort of the mind is in space, but the body is almost never really present. And my sense is that for him, because of this obliqueness or this reticence or this sense of the private, he never wanted to open that particular lyrical space, the famous lyrical space between the I and the you. So he opens the space between the I and the many, to, I think again, to evade that singularity of what we think about as love. So we could extend my argument into something about, well, then there's some other kinds of loves, and I guess the way I've thought about those other kinds of loves for him is this idea of attention, because I think attention for him is the thing that that causes him to care, and that his love is a kind of is quite big. It isn't really directional, I mean, it's an odd thing. When I talk about my relationship with him, one of the first things I say is that I loved him, and I say it as a kind of, almost the way in which he describes this here, as a kind of consent or agreement that was just present, like there it is. And it wasn't to do with his fame or even his work, just his being, his being. Which is not really what you want me to talk about, but it is a funny kind of way in which intimacy, maybe that's another way of framing it, is not the ways in which he understood intimacy, I think, are very complicated and not driven by. In one of these poems, there's a direct talking about sex, which he says, as many people are doing these days more, appalled him, I think. I think he wanted that part of the erotic connection to be very underplayed. So love then becomes much more Christian in a way, kind of the general love, the love of the world, maybe even, like Arendt, love for the world. I think that was part of him. He was so possessive. He had many possessions, but he wasn't possessive. He didn't seem to want to lay claims on persons. Everyone wanted to claim him, though. I mean, that was a really interesting inversion. You know, all of these younger poets wanted to lay claim on him. That at all sort of helpful. I don't think it's really what you intended.
My second question, would have to do with something very interesting you said too about the trope of circularity in self-portrait, all of these circular objects, and so we're including on the here itself, of course. And for me, it seems that the rivalry, what becomes the rivalry between the painter and the poet, has to do with the very question of, turns around the question of the trope. A trope meaning turn, and there are all these questions of turning and twisting and swerving and so forth in the text. And finally, the rivalry turns into the trope, as you put it, the trope of circularity as enclosure and holiness, as you said, for Parmigianino.
Yeah.
And the poet is the trope on the side. In other words, the constant swerving away from. And I sort of see the rivalry between image and text as being constructed around what you said there about the trope of, circularity.
Yeah, that's a great comment. I think you're absolutely right, and I think that that's one of the reasons. I think that's why I try to bring out the thing about music, because I think for the behaviors of music are more agreeable to Ashbery than the behaviors of images, for exactly this reason, because images are, they don't, and maybe that portrait interested him because it was so bizarre in relation to image, that it was so distorted. And I think also the other thing that I kind of touched on here, but along with his acceptance of the partial knowledge, not having to know everything about everything, that humility toward the partial, which I find very moving. And I can't remember what I was going to say. That track just disappeared. The partial. So I'm trying to think about the way. I don't know. What do I?
Partial is moving because it's a trope. Tropes do that.
Yeah.
They veer.
Yeah, there's something that's very clear that he's tracking. And he doesn't want to say that it's just his thoughts. That's the other thing that's interesting. That's not sufficient. Because I don't think he really wanted to be known as a purely cerebral poet. And that the sensuousness and the delight in the ordinary is there. But it's so different from someone like O'Hara. I mean, they couldn't be less like each other in terms of the way in which the ordinary came to them. Very different understanding of that. One of you has to be brave enough.
And you said said that writing about Ashbery, you had the impression that everything was happening by way of postscript, which I thought was really beautiful. Can we not see this as? Can we not see his work almost like as a poetry generator in a way that anything we have is already text, and therefore there is no sense of originality or authenticity that we can actually go back to, because what we always have is text that proliferates. Is that what the impression that you have when you read it? In other words, is everything postscript and doors banging?
I think the way I would answer that, which is again, I think maybe a little oblique to what you're asking me, has to do with Ashbery's resistance to the analytical as the way in which we understand truth-telling or meaning-making. He's very, very deliberately, he messes with logic so constantly and is so uninterested in the desire to codify or stabilize or make singularities, actually, I think. That the poem, the work, particularly in this book sets out so many of his kind of, everywhere you look, there's both something that you can use to describe him, but there's also this, they're like, he's like a kind of magician saying, I can do that, I can do that, I can do that, and I'll do this too. And there's this sort of incredible confidence in this work that maybe even now, it's hard to imagine how completely strange it was in the beginning of Ashbery, people trying to figure out how to think about it, because everybody had thought about poetry in a different kind of a way. And even though there are these predecessors that gave room for him, of course, it's not like he came out of nowhere. But this predilection of his saying, reading, this is one of the ways in which I think about these things, that reading is an experience as much as eating or sleeping or, making love. Reading should be like that. So he wants to offer you, this goes back maybe to your question, this encounter that is so engrossing and preoccupying that you don't really need something outside of it, because I think, it didn't land up, there is another version of this talk, it's so funny. I had 100 versions, the last one didn't come here, but in that one, there's a line that says something about the embrace between the mortal and the eternal, which I think is suggested in some of these moments, where the thing, when I say, what is that thing when he says there's a beginning and ending outside of the poem, well, I think that one of the things that this book does, and I think in other of his work too, he comes up to the mortal space or close to it. And when he comes up to that space, the eternal meets it, right? They don't actually greet each other, but there is something that happens there. And you feel, every now and then you feel the pressure of that end space. And again, like Stein, I was thinking that Stein, her total dislike of narration, once, at some point I thought, Gertrude Stein never wanted to die. That's why she made those crazy things, because she just wanted to be constantly, doing the living. And he's not dissimilar. I think there was a kind of way, and then as I think said to you the other night, there's a way, I also think that why this work is not frivolous or meager, is that I think that the shadow space is death. And I think the shadow space is his brother's death, probably. So he wrote always with a very early awareness of a very severe loss. And so the poems really are a way of filling up that place of loss, but not by grieving. Again, he doesn't want to take the normal path to love or grief or any of these things that are the material of poetry. So the other part of your question is, yes, it seems to me that the permission granted through Ashbery to find different routes to the poetic, which are not through the self, for me that's the most important thing, is a tremendous gift if people take it up. We're in a time now where that is very, very difficult to do, almost impossible. because of the closures around identity that are making that kind of freedom or that kind of generosity, which I think is another word for it, very difficult. And the demand for a certain kind of intensity, which the intensities are there, but they're like in a painting. You have a painting, and then there are these fantastic little. If you think about Pollock, for example, you see first you look at Pollock, you think, oh, it's all chaos, and then you look at it, no, it's all order, and then there are these amazing, like the snow that you said, these glints of brilliant red or whatever, and you begin to track those things. He's like that. He has that scintillating surface. Although I don't think he liked the abstract expressionists at all. It's another story.
To continue what you were saying about this distrust of self in a poem that has that prefix, I think it's perhaps something that students might find difficult to find their way around.
Right.
Refusal of self. I wonder if in a way you might not understand. Going back to what you were saying about specificity being discarded in favour of this idea of continuum, leg, instead. Perhaps the prefix should be understood not as referring to self, the self, but almost meaning auto. Right? A portrait that's, as you have self-driving cars, self-propelled, the self, in the sense that the portrait is self-providing, that it much more has to do with the poem being a mirror machine, in a sense, perhaps, rather than a portrait of any, as you said, any singular self.
Yeah, it's very nice. I think now we have this new genre, autofiction, that people are talking about. Ben Lerner, I think, has written 2 very good books of autofiction, and now there's another one. I think the way I think about it is that the way in which we've come to think about the idea of a self is probably not necessarily the idea that portrait painters in other times or thought of themselves, because it's certainly way before Freud, who did a really good job of making us think peculiarly about self. So I like that thought that of a self as a kind of generator, right? Is that what you're saying? It's a sort of generative thing. And I think that the first thing to do if you've got to be teaching this book is to just to remind everybody that this title is the book, and then there's the poem with that title, and they're not the same, because inside of this are all these other poems that add up, to a kind of portraiture, I guess you could say. But he has to have been completely conscious of that pleasurable and doubling. Yeah.
Can I make just a remark?
Yes.
Because you were, before the previous question, speaking about how difficult it would be to continue in this open vein of Ashbery's poetry. And I was thinking that what strikes me is that this openness happened almost as a response to the closure of the 1950s. I just wondered if you'd comment.
Yeah, I think you're absolutely right, and I think being here helped because all of that new criticism and the idea that a poem was some strange puzzle that you had to unpuzzle or get underneath. I remember thinking, the poem is underneath the poem? How could that be? Why isn't the poem really on the surface of the poem? And there's a lot of argument here about that, like the surface is all there is. And so I think that the energies that were going on in 1950s poetics, which I'm happily maybe a little too young to remember, but I do remember that, for example, so-called confessional poetry was a very, very main part of the American imagined, and in those poems, the self was the key figure. So the desire to escape from that kind of mirror into another kind of mirroring, which is sort of interesting to think about. If you could think about the poem as, I had this idea, I often had this idea that he had this kind of scansion, this thing that could go like that, like those big machines. And in a way, the mirror for Ashbery was looking out, not looking in, that he was capturing things. I think it was, this motion seems right. I don't think it was ever still, the mirror. And the 50s were so pernicious and so peculiarly insistent on a certain idea of the good life, obviously, through advertising and so on. And I don't think he and his whole group of people, there were a lot of them, Jane Freilacher and this one, Rudy Burkhardt, these wonderful folks who were in the city kind of having a very good time. If you guys ever had a chance to look at the early films they made together, they're so wonderful and silly. And that's the other thing I have to say before we leave. The one thing I really regret about my paper is that it's so serious, because one of the things that I love about him is how great, how deep his humor was. Not in the comic sense, but he had this amiable detachment that gave rise to a very particular kind of humor, which is the opposite of self-seriousness. It's the opposite of this kind of, I'm a great poet, therefore I will talk like this. I don't know, something about that. And Stevens has some of that too, but Stevens is so cerebral and anxious, and that he can't, that his comedy is a comedy of desperation. Ashbery's is not. It's much more the comedy of I don't know, the word mildness comes to mind. Mild, what do you think? You were around him a lot. I don't think it's comedic isn't quite right, but it is some kind of thing. He loved watching comedies. He watched a lot of television, So that's the other thing, He didn't spend all of his life thinking about high art. Okay, goodbye. Thanks for coming.